Hello, everyone. I am Abraham Newman, and I am the director of the Mortara Center here at Georgetown University. Before we start this event, I just want to acknowledge that Georgetown University's success today is in part the product of enslaved labor and the sale of enslaved people. And to learn more about Georgetown University's effort to understand and address its role in injustices of slavery, you can look at slavery.georgetown.edu. So today we are thrilled to host two experts to have a conversation about AI, digital markets, and national security. This is part of a year-long effort that the Mortara Center, along with Kate McNamara and myself, that we're undertaking to think about how the digital economy is transforming the way that we need to think about national security. And we've had a host of conversations ranging from cybersecurity to social media, today's event on AI, and the full schedule can be found on our website. I also want to acknowledge that this program is supported by the Board of Regents at Georgetown University, as well as a grant from the Open Society Foundation. So today we have two speakers that will address this issue. First, we have Mike Horowitz, who is the director of the Perry Worldhouse Center at the University of Pennsylvania, and Elsa Kania, who is an adjunct senior fellow with the Technology and National Security Program at the Center for New American Security. Each speaker will have about 10 to 12 minutes just to set the table of the conversation. Then I'll ask a few follow-up questions for those people that are in the DC area. I like to think of myself as the digital national security Kojo Namdi. And we'll have just kind of, like a discussion. At that point, you should feel free to put questions in the chat. And then I'll raise those to our two guest speakers to think through, both what do we know about these questions of the intersection of AI and national security, and what do we need to know? So with that, let me turn it over to Mike first, who will start the presentation, and then we'll hear from Elsa, and then we'll have the discussion. So thanks again, everybody, for joining, and let's get started.
Thanks, Abe. Can you hear me okay? It's really a delight to be here with you and Kate and so many friends. I wish we were doing these things in person all the time now, as opposed to online, but that, I guess, remains the world that we live in for the indefinite future. And I'm excited to be here today to talk about something I've spent a lot of time working on over the last several years, which is the sort of nexus of AI and economics and national security. And in some ways, the work I've been doing is the next iteration or the applied follow-on to some of the work I did earlier in my career, thinking about military innovations and the diffusion of military innovations. Since when I was kind of looking ahead at what was next, I started thinking a lot about robotics and AI and how militaries might think about using them. So why don't we start with what I mean when I say AI, since it's a term that's often, contested or confusing, I guess, in that what I mean is broadly computers doing things that we used to think required human intelligence. But if you pick up 10 AI textbooks, you'll get 10 slightly different definitions. And the definition of AI is kind of a moving target, in that we used to think that if a computer could play chess, that it would be a really smart computer. And then, of course, that became, not like a completely trivial task for a computer, but, you have computers that can beat the best chess players in the world. And then we're like, oh, that's just programming. And then we thought if a computer could could win at a game like Go, that'd be a really smart computer, that'd be artificial intelligence. And then of course that happens, 5 or 6 years ago. And then we're like, oh, but that's just like programming, plus a little bit of forecasting. So that's not really that smart. And I mean this to say that we have a tendency to define things that we can do with computing power as programming, and for artificial intelligence to always be the thing that's next. So we never get there. But needless to say, over the last several years, advances in machine learning approaches to AI in particular have triggered a lot of interest in AI and a massively growing industry in the private sector and interest by governments around the world, the United States, China, Russia, many others. And I think it's important to place this in context that AI at the end of the day is about data. And there was that idea, I don't know, a decade or so ago, this like notion of data as the new oil, which I always found a little bit troubling and probably incorrect, because it's not about the quantity of the data that you have that really matters. It's about the quality of the data that you have, and that algorithms work because they're trained on some set of data, and like how they do, there are lots of different ways to do that, but they're trained on some set of data, and then have the ability essentially to forecast what is like, to identify or forecast what is likely to happen based on that training. And that training might be a one-shot deal. That training could be updated at times. There are lots of different ways that could happen that we can get into in the Q&A. But fundamentally, that means questions about AI and the promise and peril of AI are questions about data, which makes it the starting point essentially for effective AI. And one of the things that I think is really interesting here is that AI is also not a widget. It's a general purpose technology. We can think about plugging algorithms into lots of things, from, I mean, like the way that Zoom backgrounds work, to the ads that are delivered on the phones that like half of the people in this are probably looking at right now, to lots of other kinds of things. And that, so like the combustion engine, like electricity, like computers in general, I think about AI as a general purpose technology. And that's important, I think, in this conversation, because it generates, think about like within economics, general purpose technologies are treated in some ways different than dual use technologies. And in the national security context, we're used to talking about dual use technologies, especially in thinking about like proliferation controls on weapons of mass destruction. But general purpose technologies are much, much bigger, because they're things that can affect our lives in lots of different ways, including the military arena, including the economic arena, but in many other areas as well. And this gets to the notion then of what does it mean to lead in AI, which in many ways is the question that a lot of people have focused on these days. When you hear somebody like Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google, talk about the notion that the U.S. could be following behind China in AI, what does something like that actually mean? And the answer is that it's sort of unclear. What I want to sort of unpack with my time is the different ways that AI can shape the sort of intersection of technology and national security, depending on what kind of AI that you're talking about. And by kind of AI, I mean that in a couple of different dimensions. First is that the uncertainty parameter surrounding what is possible with algorithms is really high. There's some published research that involves surveying AI ML experts, and then a new study that actually I participated in that does the same, that suggests like really broad confidence intervals. If you ask people doing the research, when could an AI write a best-selling novel, that people weren't buying like as a gag, but buying because they like had no idea. You'll see some people will say, oh, that's going to happen in like 5 years, and some people will say that will never happen. And for lots of different kinds of AI sorts of tasks, you have really wide, really high levels of uncertainty, even among experts, which actually is pretty complicated from an investment perspective. Like how much should you then be spending on it, which matters both for businesses thinking about it from that perspective, for regulatory agencies thinking about regulation and about things like export controls, and for militaries trying to decide sort of how many chips that they want to put in the AI basket in one way or another. So that's the first thing, sort of uncertainty about the trajectory of AI. The second thing is uncertainty about how important it is to be on the cutting edge. In that a lot of uses of AI at sort of machine learning sort of approaches, you can break into very discrete sort of buckets. So things like image classification, vision, those forecasting, those types of decision support, like those types of things. And if what you want is an image classification algorithm, you could go out and like download quite a few of them. Like how exactly good are they? Like unclear. But a lot of these things are sort of widely available already. And what it means to use them at an elite level is in some ways about the appropriateness of the application as much as anything else. In that, algorithms are pretty brittle. They work, until somebody invents like artificial general intelligence, they work in the context that they were designed for. If you take them outside that context, they're likely to break. Also, if you're thinking about this from a national security context, if you're trying to deploy algorithms in systems for important uses by militaries, adversaries are going to try to hack the algorithm, which makes cybersecurity really important. They're going to try to poison the data at the front end to mess up the training of it. They're going to try to do all sorts of things to throw things off that you have to take into account, which in some ways, along with the data point I made earlier, makes cybersecurity another sort of essential for what it means to even have sort of AI that works. But when we think about then this question of what kind of AI you need, it kind of leads me down two different pathways. And I think one of the challenges is that we don't entirely know the answer when thinking about the importance then from a national security perspective. The first is you can imagine algorithms like, say, image classification algorithms, if anybody's familiar with something like, I don't know, like Project Maven in the US military, where you have lots of different kinds of companies around the world, in the United States and China and elsewhere, that have designed image classification algorithms. So then what does it mean to be a leader in that, to be the best one? And how long will that leadership role last? We're fond in some ways in our industry of talking about things like first mover advantages. But first mover advantages are for general purpose technologies where there's profit motive for companies in dozens of countries to develop them, are probably likely to be pretty short, which means that the cost of not being first might be pretty limited. It might be relatively easy to catch up. And in having the best algorithm, say if you're a military, might not be quite as important as having a secure algorithm, frankly, which means that military applications, say of AI, based in algorithms that have commercial components, that have clear sort of commercial derivatives, the first mover advantages are likely to be fairly limited to them. And so, which then impacts international security kind of accordingly. But there's another type of algorithm that I don't think we haven't really totally gotten our heads around, which are algorithms that might only be useful for militaries. Not just where the data that you're using to train them is militarily, is data that militaries have, but where there's not necessarily a commercial analog. Like, and this, we occasionally see this in the technology world. Like, think about stealth technology. Like you only need it if you're like a Bond villain or a nation state or something. Like, there's not really a commercial use for stealth technology. And so in this context, the AI applications, like say, making sense of providing decision support on a multi-dimensional battlefield, that's the kind of thing where, well, not a lot of, not every company is going to be working on that sort of thing necessarily, and getting there first could have potentially huge payoffs, which is not to say that like that would be like the stealth of AI, because I think like nothing is probably going to be as militarily, like exclusively military oriented as stealth, but in that kind of situation, first mover advantages can be more sustainable, can be harder for other actors to get in the game. And so thus the advantage to being first could be larger. The problem is that it can be kind of hard to tell ex ante which of these sort of roads that you're on with different kinds of applications. And that makes things especially challenging. And let me add in one other thing on this that I think is really interesting in the context of the current debate and conversation about AI, and then I'll stop, since I'm actually very excited to listen to Elsa and what she has to say on this, because she's done incredible work on this topic, which is that the debate that we have about AI right now, I think is actually really different than the debate that we often have about military innovations in general, which is that the debate about military innovation in general is often between sort of reformers in the military that say like, all right, we want to make the aircraft carrier the heart of the Navy. And like it's in, the story of like the battleship admirals trying to preserve the role of the battleship, like versus, those that see the potential of the aircraft carrier. That's actually a little different than what we see now. Because what we see now is, say in the United States context, like 3 different US administrations from Obama through Biden, including Trump, you've had lots of senior leaders talking about the importance of AI for US national security and of the US military being a sort of strong AI adopter. And so then the holdouts in some way, it's less like you have a clear debate the way that you have in a lot of previous military innovation cases. The other side of this often comes from the private sector, actually, from AI ML researchers and from some academics, others who are concerned about misuses of AI, about safety questions, reliability questions, ethics questions about the things that we want machines to do. And I think that different debate or conversation is actually really interesting in the context of, if we think about sort of the history of what these sorts of relationships look like. And I'll end by saying that I actually think that ongoing debate is a little bit of a false dichotomy, since AI that works has to be safe and reliable. It's an intrinsic component of effective AI, whether for a business or for national security purposes, is safe and reliable AI, which means in reality, you need both of these things. And that's the path to success, whether in the private sector or the public sector. And with that, let me stop for now and turn it over to Elsa.
Great. Thanks again, Mike. Elsa, to you.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy and honored to be joining the conversation today. And we'll try to build upon some of the great insights that Mike had raised and pose some questions for further consideration and discussion as well. And I think the first question or concern I'd highlight when it comes to how do we make sense of these topics is, I'm going to start by saying that my philosophy is there's no such thing as an expert on these issues at the moment. I think we all are students of the topic, literally and metaphorically. And I think there are some really critical questions for, in terms of methodology, in terms of what kinds of expertise need to be coming together in this conversation. And how do we get a sense of what's real and what's hype? And I think certainly some of the study of the sort of myths and fears that can be influencing the conversation can be fascinating in and of itself. But I think definitely observationally, it is fascinating to observe the dichotomy of perspectives between, for instance, those who spend a lot of time trying to make machine learning work with messy data and real world scenarios, and as someone who's tried to do even just some very basic applications of machine learning and natural language processing, having results that are effective and meaningful can be challenging at best. And certainly someone who's very cognizant of my own limitations and see myself as a student of getting to a point where I can do anything more useful or credible with these techniques in my own research. I think definitely sort of that sort of, I think all of us who are inclined to think about AI in society or national security ought to start from a perspective of humility when it comes to sort of both recognizing how challenging it is to make sense of trends and technologies that are complex, that are evolving very quickly, that are very disparate across disciplines and applications. And also just that I think there's a lot of work to be done in terms of sort of education of senior leaders and policymakers and sort of recognition of the realities of challenges behind implementation, because I think sometimes those practical concerns can be overshadowed by the volume and tempo of these debates and the sort of breathless anxieties over an AI arms race, which I think are legitimate to some extent, but sometimes the headlines or the declarations by governments can paint a very different picture than that which you get from sort of either personal struggles with trying to realize some of the potential of these technologies, or spending more time engaging with those who are working on these issues in real world applications. And certainly we have seen incredible progression of artificial intelligence, but I think there continues to be sort of often this gap between realities and expectations, and that gap is closing. And sometimes we also see the pace of progress overtake our expectations. But I think that's definitely a theme I see and I struggle with in my own work and in these conversations. How do we convey that uncertainty between the fact that in the long term, AI truly could be transformative in ways that we can't even begin to imagine, but yet in the near term, it is limited and continues to be often frustrating as an endeavor. And I think the question that sort of arises from that can be sort of what matters or what is impactful, and how do we get a sense of where sort of AI does start to have real world impacts or the potential for disruption and transformation, terms that are often sort of tossed about in these debates. And I think especially considering that we are still having these conversations on Zoom, given the pandemic situation, I think the ways in which AI has been used in responses to COVID-19 around the world is is fascinating in terms of the benefits and difficulties of this use case. And certainly, I think looking, for instance, as somebody who focuses primarily on the state of play of science and technology in China, watching and trying to make sense from afar of the different elements of China's response to the pandemic, I think has been really fascinating in terms of how a lot of the most impactful measures have been very traditional or old-fashioned in terms of, as we've heard, the lockdowns, contact tracing, human engagement with trying to provide services and control the spread of the disease, but certainly have seen China start to move to introduce AI in healthcare and medicine in ways that are practical and not sort of the sensationalized killer robots or or even some of the more visible applications like drones delivering your groceries or disinfecting public spaces, but even starting to use machine learning to analyze chest x-rays, which were very backlogged in the Chinese medical system, and launching an initiative to to create a major database and start to develop AI models that could identify whether somebody had COVID-19 from their chest X-ray or other diseases. And I think that's definitely an element of China's agenda in AI applications in medicine and healthcare, and trying to integrate data that is an illustration of some of the impacts and potential. And I think also sort of does start to provide a little bit more granularity than the headlines you may have seen of late of sort of, is China the AI superpower? Concerns raised from the Pentagon of, has China already beat the US in the race for AI, as one official who'd recently resigned had declared. And I think, I guess my personal preference would, or inclination would be to say, when we talk about this as a race, or as if we can tell who is leading or who is losing, we do lose a lot of the complexity and sort of sense of the real world implications of these technologies, including because focusing on notions of winning or leadership, I think can obscure the fact that what we mean by AI, the different use cases and applications, talking about this as a singular phenomenon is really elides over what is much more dependent upon context, whether we're talking about which countries or which companies have managed to collect which types of data for which particular models and the quality and reliability of that data, or even, I think, as Mike had also mentioned, the question fundamentally of, I think in the United States, we often are inspired by invention, by ideas of creation and generation and being pioneers on the cutting edge of this. And that's sort of the mythos of Silicon Valley and Cambridge, Massachusetts, my hometown as well. But I think, as Mike had mentioned, when so much is readily accessible and diffuses, there is sort of a question that I think arises, especially when we're thinking about what should be a priority or focus of efforts, is I think the reality that in terms of actual impacts, the capacity to implement and leverage AI within organizations can be far more consequential than simply having the best paper or the greatest breakthrough when we think about the long-term impacts on societies or different domains, whether in economics or national security. So it's sort of a plea, especially to those students and scholars and others with far more expertise than I on many elements of this, that I think we have to continue complicating the conversation, so to speak, and examining this as sort of this AI revolution as a phenomenon that is quite idiosyncratic. And I think when we think about also some of these questions from the angle of policy and strategy, there is a certain tension or potential contradiction insofar as we see these statements by governments that AI is a strategic technology, and yet the sort of this framing of AI as a focus of competition, of militaries that are seeking advantages in future warfare, but beyond that, those plans and those programs, a lot of the momentum is being generated by enterprises that have complex relationships with their governments in some cases, and relationships that are informed by politics, ideology, political economy. And I think as someone who had worked on, for instance, translating China's initial new generation AI development plan, I think certainly those sorts of plans and articulations of aspiration can be informative in terms of how we see the ways in which governments try to set a bar, try to create incentives and shape the direction, but often states aren't in the driver's seat here. They are reacting, they are trying to control or take advantage of companies or build public-private partnerships. And I think when we think about long-term trajectories between the US and China, the different relationships these governments have with the technology companies that are very much at the forefront and have capacity that in many cases governments don't have that continues to be a critical question, especially as we watch the tech crackdown underway in China today, which frankly has surprised me and is targeting sort of some of the monopolies and economies of scale that have given some Chinese companies perhaps unique competitive advantage and access to data. And yet we're seeing this tension between the Chinese government wanting to harness these companies relative to the sort of fear of the power that these companies can have. And I think there are some interesting parallels between both parallels and divergences between how the US and Chinese governments and their companies, some of which are quite international, others of which are framing themselves more as national champions, are approaching these issues. So I hope this has been a useful framing to some of the sort of thoughts that I am grappling with as I try to study and continue inquiry as a student of these issues. And I'll very much look forward to your questions and continuing the conversation going forward.
Great. Thanks so much, Elsa and Mike, for these great remarks to kick off the conversation. I'm going to ask people in the audience, if you want to put questions in the chat, then we can start to collect those and I'll start feeding them to our speakers. I wanted to, so I think both of you have, let's settle down, folks. There's all this craziness, AI, and, is it really going to be anything? But I wonder if we look at the private sector, that we can already see the potential for many of these, what we're about to encounter governments to do. So I feel like the Facebook revelations of the last several weeks have demonstrated that algorithms can promote bias, whether it's about personal appearance in children, or whether it's about extremism in Poland. The evidence is pretty clear that the algorithms do generate this type of obsessive extremism. And so if you're thinking about subversion as one act that governments play in, it seems like the AI has demonstrated, or the evidence has demonstrated that AI can do that. So I kind of wonder if we can look at other examples from where we know what industry is already doing with these technologies in a private sector, for money, to learn what governments, what is realistic and where the concern should be. I think we're probably I'm more skeptical of they'll shut down the nuclear reactor, that kind of a thing. But flipping an election or creating internal dissent within a democracy, those seem to be pretty important things that actors have tried to do for decades. And so if this is another tool. Maybe just a second question is, one of the questions from the audience is about, do we already see a military industrial complex developing in this space? So the connection between the firms, so maybe it's not Boeing in this case, but maybe it's Amazon and Microsoft, and kind of how do we think about that and what the politics will be of this new AI military industrial complex? So those are two different questions. You can answer them, not answer them, skip around, whatever part, whatever that made you think of. But I'll turn first to Mike and then to Elsa to kind of start the conversation going.
Yeah, I think those are both great questions, and let me take them in turn. And I'll maybe I might spend a little more time on the second one. I think the first question, I think the Facebook example is really interesting because it shows the way that like we humans are still the problem. If you some of the problems with the Facebook algorithm are like that like a human programmed the algorithm to make the angry emotion have 5 times the weight for showing people things than the thumbs up, than the thumbs up on Facebook. Like that's not the algorithm's choice. That's a person or a person at the behest of a company that programmed it to do that. And so it is certainly true that I would say on the one hand, when we trace back a lot of these examples of algorithmic bias, what we get to is essentially the same biases that impact us and our society and whatever those like biases may be, getting encoded into algorithms. And so, which means like as ever, we're the problem and the solution in some ways. And I would expect then the same to be true. Like if you designed, say, an algorithm designed to help a military figure out who to promote, like what you actually would have a lot of data to be able to do that, say, if you're the United States. But like, what would you select on the basis of? How would you weigh different characteristics? All of those, you could design an algorithm that could do that. And that algorithm would probably be actually very good and would have a ton of data to be able to make those choices. But as we see in company algorithms, whether it's, like YouTube promoting Alex Jones's stuff at one point, or Facebook, it's that it depends on what you're trying to maximize with your algorithm. And how you design it. I think the lesson from the private sector is that these are fraught choices of values, as much as they are, even more so in some ways than they are technology questions, which governments are going to need to take into consideration. I think that you see there's like the military industrial complex growing up around AI. I'm not sure I would call it that necessarily, but essentially you have 3 different like types of companies in some ways that are involved. I think the first is you have your traditional defense primes, like your Boeings or whatever, who are certainly not at the cutting edge of AI, but are trying to acquire AI startups and other, AI kinds of companies to let them so they can play in that field. The second is you have the big tech companies who are increasingly have been contractors with the US government. I mean, Google famously decided not to renew its Project Maven contract. And due to sort of ethical objections to like drone strike surveillance, essentially, or not drone strike surveillance, drone surveillance. But 2 years later at the National Security Commission of AI interim meeting, a senior VP of Google sat on stage and talked about how excited they were to work with the Department of Defense, and the fear that Project Maven choice would cause, Amazon, Microsoft, et cetera, to not want to work on defense projects, I think turned out to be misplaced. The difference is that while the primes rely on government for support, the tech companies don't. It's like a nice ancillary business for them, potentially. And so they don't depend on the government the way that, say, the defense primes do. which makes the role of big tech companies in the sort of growing AI infrastructure in the government a little bit different, because it's not that the money is necessarily different, like for the contract size or something is necessarily different. It's that the relative importance of the government to them, of government contracts to them, is lower. And then the third category of companies are these AI startups who want to work on defense. Palantir is now big enough, I'm not sure I'd put it in that category anymore, but it's also publicly traded, whatever. But think Rebellion, Spark Cognition, some of these kinds of companies that are attempting to, in some ways have ambitions of being the next big contractors for the Defense Department, for other parts of the national security community, for the government, but focused on AI. And, I think it'll be interesting to see, as Rebellion, for example, evolves over the next several years, whether they get purchased by a defense prime, whether they sort of grow themselves, et cetera. And there are lots of people working in a 2 steps forward, 1 step back way to try to help make the contracting process easier for those startups. Because one of the things, if you bump into somebody on the street in DC and you ask them, what does the Defense Department need to do to get better? Whatever, 9 out of 10 people will mutter acquisition reform within the first 15 seconds of that answer. And that is almost certainly true. And some of these AI companies have run into it. I put a Govini as another example of that. And there are people working to make that better, but it's obviously still an obstacle. So yes, we need acquisition reform.
Elsa.
And I would agree that people are the problem on the first question. And I think it is incredibly disturbing to see how the illusion of objectivity that comes with algorithms can obscure human biases having sometimes horrific effects. And sometimes that is more blatant than in other cases. And some of the most obvious examples, for instance, would be when bias is not a bug, but a feature in design. And certainly certain Chinese technology companies, Huawei among them, have ended up in interesting situations with regard to revelations about algorithms under development that, especially in facial recognition and in surveillance, and companies like SenseTime and iFlyTech have had sort of interesting engagements there as well, where you have a facial recognition system with a Uyghur alarm that is built in, that is literally sort of designed to differentiate and discriminate against an ethnicity that is subject to horrific human rights abuses within China, and technology companies that are building that in, likely either at the behest of the Chinese government or as a point that they think will make their technology more appealing and competitive for Chinese government surveillance applications. And I think that's one of the most some of the most egregious cases where sort of deliberate discrimination is built into the design of these systems. And I think sometimes how obviously troubling some of those examples are can distract from or present an interesting comparison with examples in a US context, where we also see bias and unethical behavior that is perhaps less blatant, but subtler, and therefore sort of harder to identify and resolve in some cases. And I think certainly questions around the use of AI and predictive policing and the reinforcement of systemic racism in policing, or the provision of public services or job applications. I think definitely I will defer to others who have far more expertise than I on those problems and solutions, but I think there definitely are, if the US intends to be a leader and set a positive example in AI, I think we have to both sort of continue to call out egregious abuses, but also continue to be as transparent as we can in discussing and confronting problems and biases within our own companies and our own systems, and recognize that the problems and abuses can take many forms in this case. And I think there's sort of the interesting question when we see some of these concerning developments in terms of how algorithms can have either intended or unintended effects, recommendation systems, for instance. We've started to see different approaches from the between the U.S. and Chinese governments and how they're responding to this. I think in the U.S. We've had a lot of debate on the topic, but we haven't seen a lot of action or regulatory responses so far. Whereas interestingly, in China, the Cyberspace Administration of China has been proactive and perhaps even preemptive in starting to release guidelines to regulate, for instance, algorithmic recommendation systems. And that's been a sort of comprehensive approach that is perhaps may have some public benefit in sort of avoiding some of the harms or addictive behaviors and issues that can arise when technology companies in any country continue to be motivated by profit and engagement. But sort of an interesting dimension of how the Chinese government thinks about AI regulation is concern with controllability in terms of security and stability and sort of ways to avoid any adverse impacts from the perspective of the Chinese Communist Party. And I have joked at times, though I think this actually is in some respects a not unserious conversation in the context of Chinese politics and the Chinese Communist Party, that we, I think, are just beginning to see ways in which ideology may impact AI development in China in different ways, whether that's a chatbot that was censored not to comment on Xi Jinping, or not to say things that would be politically incorrect, but within the parameters of the CCP's authority, or sort of question whether in a societal or military context of how do you ensure that AI is consistent with Xi Jinping thought. Will we see AI political commissars in the PLA, or perhaps not, but certainly there is discussion of how to use AI in political work and indoctrination of personnel, which is, and if you're promoting, for instance, based on who is both expert and reliable politically, sort of a play on Mike's example of sort of how the US military might use it, what would a system like that look like in a Chinese context? So yeah, so I guess haven't quite gotten to the totality of the questions, but I guess I'd close with, I think a lot of what comes into play are questions around incentives, authorities, and ways in which companies and governments are engaging and struggling with concrete approaches, whether to, in the case of the Chinese government and Chinese military in particular, new mechanisms to acquire technology, to partner with companies and startups beyond the traditional defense industry, new funding, some mechanisms that are knockoffs of US initiatives like the Defense Innovation Unit, with Chinese characteristics across several major cities. And sort of, I think the question or the common challenge for any government will be policymaking and bureaucracy, and overcoming some of the inherent difficulties in managing and integrating these technologies when in some cases there is no obvious answer or solution at this point.
Great. So we only have 13 minutes left, and we have probably 10 or so questions. And so the group is, there's like, the chat is going off. People want to ask a lot of questions. I'm going to group some of these, but I would ask maybe that we can kind of, go back and forth as quickly as we can, just to get to the audience's question. So there are a bunch of questions which I think center around the US-China relationship in AI. And so I'm going to kind of pose a bunch of these, and then you can pick the ones that you're most interested in. The first is just about the macro level. Like, is the arms race, the framing of that, is that something that is exaggerated? Is it legitimate? Is it something that we should really be thinking about? When people talk about like TikTok's going to steal your data, like, does that matter? Is the Chinese government really stealing your data? But I think then there's a second level question, which is both about like a military, but it's also an economic kind of threat, which is about China becoming the first mover in some of these domains. Like, we see how Europe doesn't own any of these technologies, and they're very dependent on the United States for most of these systems. would it be okay if China became the first mover? And do they have the advantage because of the structure of their data and the structure of their firms and the relationship between the firms and the government? The last bucket of questions I'm going to say are about, will there be different environments of AI because of the domestic structures and systems in these two, in the US and China, both about data differences in data quality, but also about like differences in how information is processed in a democracy and an autocracy, that will produce, unique AI type systems. So that's like the question, not really sure you could disagree with the premise. So the arms race, the competitiveness challenges, and then the third, like, is there distinct AI emerging because of the political systems and the way they function? Okay, I will throw those to you. And remember, you don't need to answer all those things, and we only have 11 minutes left. Maybe I'll go to Elsa first.
Sure, great questions. I will try to keep my answers concise as best I can. And I guess first I'd say clearly, AI has become a focus of military competition. My concern with the arms race framing is that it distracts from recognition that the economic implications of AI may be far more fundamental in terms of the long-term balance between the United States and the People's Republic of China. And again, I say this ironically as somebody who focuses more on military issues and national defense, but I do think, China's strategy of military civil fusion is predicated upon recognition that your economy is the foundation by which you generate national power, and you have to create synergies and integration within your system, in particular in ensuring that advances in emerging technologies will advance new industries that can generate a lot of value and serve as an engine to perhaps sustain economic growth at a time when the Chinese economy is encountering some headwinds, while in parallel developing military applications that are seen as perhaps decisive and perhaps giving the People's Liberation Army ways to design the terms and capabilities that could influence mechanisms of victory in the future battlefield. So definitely, I think we shouldn't fixate on concerns of an arms race at the expense of recognizing the criticality of investment, of the foundations of our economy for the long term, and ways in which AI can impact development. But I do definitely share the concerns about questions of comparative advantage from a military perspective, though I think in each case, perhaps the first and worst enemy for both militaries is their own bureaucracy. And that is sort of the fight in the near term, certainly seemingly as the US military tries to adapt and execute. And I do, looking at the PLA from afar, I do see some significant advancements in terms of perhaps the benefits of being in a system where Xi Jinping says that AI is a priority, including for military development under the auspices of intelligentization, and that does create a quite powerful momentum with the dedication of new resourcing, funding, setting an AI expert in charge of the Academy of Military Science. We haven't yet seen any, or we have not seen any or many examples of US military leaders having a technical perspective and being selected for senior positions on that basis. And I think that is to some extent a cultural or systemic question there as well. But yeah, so I think going forward, the questions of political economy and the relationships and interactions of companies and government will be critical and fascinating to examine. And I think whether that is acquisitions or sort of building public-private partnerships in a US context, which does require sort of navigating questions of law and ethics that can be quite fraught on these topics. I think that's going to be, that could be a differentiating factor. And I guess I won't quite manage to make it to all the questions, but I guess I'd say on data, it's not a natural resource in the sense that policy choices can impact how it's collected and managed and leveraged. So I think there's definitely different comparative advantages for the US and China across different types of data, and also in the capacity to start to integrate it between companies and governments for specific applications. I think that is very, as Mike had said as well, context dependent. Yeah, I do think that there are, as Caitlin had mentioned, for instance, concerns about nuclear stability and strategic stability. And I think some of that I am also concerned about the risks for algorithmic misperception, or especially when AI is used even in what's sometimes described as easier applications of sort of early warning or intelligence or identification of targets, that there is the possibility of mistakes there. I think that could be a much longer conversation unto itself. And I guess finally, when we're thinking about sort of near-term consequences, ways in which what we've seen happen incidentally in terms of AI influencing politics or creating radicalization, I think the manipulation of that in influence operations, as we are starting to see happening, and I think will continue to intensify, is, I think, a serious consideration, whether we see that as kind of motivated by profit or an element of psychological warfare and otherwise going forward. So these virtual domains, I think, continue to be incredibly contested in that regard.
Mike.
Sure, just very quickly, it's not an arms race. Because you didn't have an arms race over the combustion engine, and we didn't have an electricity arms race. You know, we had arms races over like battleships and tanks and things like that. So I think if you're looking for the future arms race, it'll be in specific applications of AI rather than an AI arms race. I think the competition is probably the better, like the more accurate verbiage essentially that I would use to describe that. TikTok is totally taking your data. Seriously, like if you use TikTok, like they are taking your data. The Chinese are very likely to have your data. On the other hand, if you are the kind of person that's already using TikTok, so many companies already have this data that, like, I mean, I don't know, like it bothers me, but like it may not bother you. If what you want is to design a surveillance algorithm, then it's possible that the Chinese have a data advantage. Simply due to scale and aforementioned TikTok. But you need different kinds of data for different kinds of algorithms. And so I don't think the structure of the Chinese economy necessarily gives them an advantage across those things. Like if you're trying to model things surrounding, like, say, warfare, the fact that the US has like lots of data from fighting wars and China doesn't, like, might be relevant. The last thing I'll say is just that I do think that the structure of the US and China matters here from a regime type perspective, and that I think that the instinct of democracies, which you see in US language about AI, is to think about using AI to enhance the ability of people to succeed. It's why the US talks in like a defense context, talks about things like human machine teaming, or, you know, enhancing the capacity of the warfighter, like those kinds of things. Whereas I think in autocratic regimes, like they don't trust their people anyway. Like that's why they're autocratic regimes. And so I think the autocratic regimes are more likely to think about algorithms as mechanisms to replace people that are unreliable anyways. And so to use that essentially to like skinny down the number of people that you need to conduct a military operation or to do whatever, because it's just cutting people that they didn't trust out in the first place. So I think the autocratic logic of AI is more about replacement. And that is actually a different kind of logic. And that's the goal, essentially, rather than a side effect, which it could be in a democracy.
Great. Okay, we have 3 minutes left. So you're going to have about 30 seconds each. But I would like, we have a kind of a general, I'm going to call it an IR theory set of questions, which are about, you know, is AI, should we just view it as a tool that actors use in international politics, or is it transforming the structure of international politics? So if you think about the airplane, you could see it as a bomber. It was a tool that was used in warfare, but you can also see aviation as transforming how the structure of international politics functioned because it transformed interdependence more broadly. Same thing with the internet. You could see the internet as a tool that actors use, or you can think about it's really altering the basic structure. So where do you guys fall down on this? Similarly, is it, when you think about the tool, is it a big enough step change in that tool, that it's changing the way politics and social interactions function? Or should we just think about it as like it's part of a bucket of, changes in decision making that we've seen from cybernetics, for many, many decades? So like, is it something that's so important that we should really focus on it in particular, or should we just see it as like, it's just a gradual evolution of something we've been dealing with for many decades? Okay, you each have 45 seconds. Mike and then Elsa.
Sure. I think applications of algorithms are tools. I mean, I already gave you my answer in some ways. I think about AI as a general purpose technology, which means that which by definition means that I think it will have transformative effects on how society functions in a way similar to something like aviation or similar to something like the combustion engine. But algorithms themselves are tools. They are tools programmed by people to achieve specific tasks. I think AI stands at the center of a whole bucket of technologies that are impacting our world: 5G, cyber, quantum, et cetera. And that algorithms are at the center of all of that, which makes, I think, understanding the politics surrounding their design, development, and use especially important. And that the change will probably look incremental at the ground level. And a lot of the theory of AI was frankly worked out like decades ago. But advances in machine learning and compute do mean that there are some game-changing capabilities starting to come online. It's what we do with them that's the question.
Elsa.
So perhaps politics and international relations will shape the course of AI as much as AI will impact those dynamics. So I think the influence goes both ways, and no technology is neutral. And I think the ways in which we see different states taking different paths or pursuing various priorities in the development of AI will be fascinating to watch. I think the ultimate impacts, or what the transformation looks like, I think is something that will play out over decades, and if we look back at the history of AI going back to the 80s or even earlier, I think we can sort of see an incremental development that eventually will create the sort of disruption that we are starting to see. But yes, I would close it. I think fundamentally, humans have agencies and states make decisions, and that does shape the technology in turn. And there are sort of inherent constraints in real world scenarios that I think do highlight how far we are from having any magical solutions there. And I say this also having in mind some of the very heart-rending challenges we've seen come into play in the course of being involved as a volunteer in evacuations from Afghanistan, and seeing the question of data be very human in terms of how to verify and evaluate those who are left behind and in danger, and how to identify and direct resources to people and manage the big data problem when there are tens and hundreds of thousands, including several hundred, perhaps thousands of Americans and permanent citizens whose data is caught in the noise, and we don't have any AI magic solutions there, despite attempts to start to bring data science to bear on the crisis and those problems. So I think any political question, any dynamic in international relations will impact AI, and I think in any crisis going forward, these questions of data coming into play will continue to be tricky and perhaps transformative. But I don't know whether we'll know it when we see it, or we'll start to see the sort of aggregation of these impacts only more slowly over time.
Great. Well, thanks, Mike, and thanks, Elsa. I mean, I think it's without a doubt, it's going to be the people and the governments that use these, and they're not just, it's not going to be neutral platforms. They're going to use them to, seek their objectives, and hopefully that'll be for the betterment of the world. But often we'll see. I'm quite skeptical. Well, thanks again for joining. In the chat, we put the next event, which is coming up very soon, on digital repression, which of course uses AI often in order to do that digital repression. But I hope you'll join us for that. And I hope everybody has a wonderful afternoon. Thanks again.